Ayotte, and now Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Leahy and the members of this committee for giving me the opportunity to testify this morning. I am a co-sponsor of the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, and I appreciate the leadership of my colleagues, Senator Ayotte and Senators Whitehouse and Klobuchar, and all of you on the committee who are working on that legislation. I'm actually here to testify, however, not on that bill, but on two bills that I've introduced. The Opioid and Heroin Epidemic Emergency Supplemental Appropriations Act. That's a mouthful, but what the bill would do is allocate $600 million in emergency funding to address this national crisis. The second bill is the Combat Heroin Epidemic and Backlog Act, which would authorize a grant program to help reduce the chronic backlog of heroin and fentanyl cases at state police crime labs. And Mr. Chairman, you and Senator Leahy and my colleague Senator Ayotte talked eloquently about the statistics that affect this epidemic. But the fact is, I believe what we have now is a pandemic. It's affecting young and old, it's affecting urban and rural, rich and poor, white and minorities, and it's spreading to every state in this country, including Alaska and Hawaii. In New Hampshire, we're losing more than a person a day to drug overdoses. Last year, 3 times as many people lost to drug overdoses as traffic accidents. And we just had a study come out on mortality rates in this country that showed that mortality rates among middle-aged white Americans are actually increasing for the first time in decades rather than decreasing. And that was attributed primarily to the rising substance abuse disorders. So, as Senator Leahy said, those statistics don't adequately describe the devastation to families who have lost loved ones and who are still struggling with trying to get loved ones into treatment. But despite all these statistics, despite the stories that Senator Ayotte and I have heard in New Hampshire and that all of you have heard in your home states, public health and law enforcement agencies at all levels lack the resources to mount an effective response to the heroin and opioid epidemic. And nationwide in 2013, nearly 9 out of 10 people who needed drug treatment did not receive it. This is tragic and it's unacceptable. And we need to mobilize a national response. You know, my legislation proposes $600 million. Specifically, it provides an additional $200 million under the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant Fund to fund state and local efforts, including law enforcement, prosecutions, and court programs, drug treatment and enforcement programs, as well as prevention and education. And lest you think $600 million is too much, remember that last year, Congress passed $5.4 billion in emergency funding to combat the Ebola outbreak, and we lost only 1 person in the United States to Ebola. In 2009, Congress passed nearly $2 billion in emergency funding just to fight a swine flu epidemic. So we need better coordination and we need more resources, and I think you'll hear from Chief Willard the challenges they're having in New Hampshire because they don't have the resources they need. I also want to touch briefly on the Combat Heroin Epidemic and Backlog Act, which is designed to help drug labs across this country, crime labs across this country, as they analyze drugs. This bill is modeled on what we did in 2005 to combat methamphetamines. And what we're seeing in New Hampshire and across this country is that state police forensic laboratories have accumulated backlogs of heroin and fentanyl cases because they don't have the resources to do the testing. In New Hampshire, the state forensic lab receives about 750 testing requests each month, but it can only process 450. And the growing backlogs result from an increase in heroin cases and a dramatic surge in fentanyl cases. And just to give you some idea of Senator Ayotte touched on this, but in New Hampshire, according to our chief medical examiner, in 2013, we had 193 overdose deaths. 18 of those were fentanyl related. In 2014, we had 326 overdose deaths. 145 of those were fentanyl related. And in 2015, we had 385 deaths from overdoses. 253 were fentanyl related. We have got to act with a sense of urgency because delays in processing drug samples have disrupted every stage of the policing and judicial processes. We are no longer able to identify combination and designer drugs by sight. Undercover law enforcement are forced to wait to verify samples before continuing investigations, and prosecutors and judges are less likely to offer plea deals without lab confirmation of a drug's authenticity. So put simply, these backlogs are keeping us from putting dangerous criminals and drug traffickers back in jail and getting them off the streets. So, Mr. Chairman, there's obviously a lot of work that we need to do to address this pandemic. I believe it's something that working together we can overcome, but it's going to take a multifaceted approach, as you've said, and we've got to act now before things get even worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you,